Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Marie, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the subject of autism and people pleasing. So, it's been quite some time since I've recorded a episode on my podcast, and it's mainly because I have been working, studying in my art therapy course, and also dealing with some personal issues. But I do feel a lot better nowadays, and of course, starting from today, I'm going to have a consistent or just as consistent as possible schedule. Of course, episodes will be continued to be released every 2 weeks on Sundays, just because it's easier for me to work it around my full-time job. As of course, those of you that have listened are aware that I do a full-time job at the moment as a receptionist for a local council. So today's episode is kind of a sensitive and personal one, mainly because being an autistic woman myself, I've had my own fair share of experiences of people pleasing, which has, of course, damaged me in some way due to not fully understanding what people pleasing was, as well as how to assert myself. But before I get into those experiences, as well as some tips, let's break down people pleasing itself. So, people pleasing from personal experience and understanding involves putting the needs of others above your own. In layman's terms, you tend to sacrifice your well being and happiness because you want to feel well liked by other people. There are many different traits to people pleasing, which typically include doing what others want, agreeing with the opinions of others, even though they don't align with your way of thinking, acting the same as others, mostly by mimicking certain behaviors in order to gain acceptance, and of course, not expressing how you really feel. So, if, say, somebody makes you upset or hurt in a way, and you don't express that, they won't understand your true feelings, especially because you are putting on a mask and acting as if everything is fine when deep inside you know you're not. Now, when it comes to people pleasing, the majority who resort to this kind of behavior get taken advantage of without realizing. And for individuals on the autism spectrum in particular, they may not understand that they're people pleasing. So, coming from personal experience, I've always had a hard time identifying people's wants, needs, and even feelings because I don't really click when it comes to identifying social cues very easily. And sometimes when I used to people please, especially in secondary school, the way I saw it, I was one of those people that would assume I was doing a kind favor for a friend as an act of kindness because I am a naturally giving person. But what I didn't realize was that people would use me for their convenience. So, for example, I used to be somebody who was very organized when it came to bringing my own equipment. So I would often bring pens, pencils, rulers, erasers, highlighters, etc. And there were instances where other girls in my classes would lose their equipment and would ask me for spares. And me, being the person I was more than willing to give a spare pen. And I would always say that you can borrow it, but just make sure you bring it back. And most of the time, people would lose my equipment and I would get really upset, especially because my parents, more so my mum in particular, would spend quite a lot of money to get me the things I needed for school because they wanted to make sure that I was organized every day. And I never really communicated how I felt, and sometimes I would try to, but this would often end in girls talking to me in a rude tone, almost to the point where it was confrontational. And at times, I would find it very difficult to speak up and advocate for myself because I didn't like confrontation. I mean, coming from personal experience, I was always somebody who wanted to stay out of fights, especially because I am not someone who's going to say slap or punch you over something petty. And I guess looking back from those past experiences has made me realize that I really wish I had advocated for myself, even when simple situations like that would arise. So, when it comes to people pleasing, if you do this really often, you often result in being burnt out. So, because you've spent so much time and energy focusing on the needs of others, you don't even have the energy to focus on yourself. And you can even go as far as neglecting yourself, even if it's doing simple tasks like cleaning. And obviously, in the case of neurodivergent individuals and neurotypical individuals, they are two completely different groups. And with a lot of individuals who fall under the autism spectrum or even another form of neurodivergence, they might even go as far as changing their entire personality in order to be accepted. And again, this is something that I have undergone during my educational years. You know, I was always really quiet, very soft spoken, and I had completely different interests to others, like my interests in gaming, anime, or manga. And I couldn't really express my true personality because I was often expected to suppress it. So I would have even my teachers and other students around me tell me how quiet I was and how it was a problem. And in turn, for example, I would try to force myself to be extroverted. So I was trying to pretty much play a character that I really wasn't like in real life. And when I'm having to put on that mask every single day, it's very exhausting because I felt like I was being suffocated in plastic. And the only instance I could truly be myself was outside of school. Now, there is a term for this, which is called fawning. So, the term of fawning basically involves changing who you are in order to impress others. And with fawning as well, it's kind of like a defense mechanism in a sense. So if you've undergone traumas like abuse, for example, then this is kind of your way of coping because that way nobody can take advantage ever again. So, with fawning, it's not just about changing yourself, it's all about appeasing others in order to avoid confrontation. And I suppose to an extent, I would often do this in secondary school, but again, I never really realized what I was truly doing. So, whenever you people please, in a sense, it's like you don't value your needs, let alone yourself as a person. And the message you give to other people around you is that your needs are important and mine are not. Now, when it comes to asserting yourself, this can be difficult for pretty much anyone, but for autistic individuals, it's even more difficult because when you think about it, being autistic, right? You're in a world that doesn't really cater to you because you fall under a minority group. The world in general caters to neurotypicals. So, in a sense, it's like you are in survival of the fittest, where you have to adapt your behaviors and mannerisms in order to fit in and be accepted by the rest of the tribe. And sometimes, in a sense, even now as a 25-year-old, I do feel like I'm either an animal or an alien that's learning human mannerisms and trying to figure out what humans do to be accepted and what they shouldn't do. So, when it comes to boundaries and asserting yourself, it is very difficult to even say the word no. In concept, it does seem very simple, but in the case of individuals with autism, they're afraid to say it because they don't want to piss off others around them. And this is a problem I've struggled with myself, where if somebody asks me for a favor, I would often say yes, or I would say maybe I can do it. So it's almost as if, again, I am trying to put my needs aside in order for acceptance from someone else. And for others who are around autistic individuals, it is hard to identify what they need. So, a lot of the times, people with autism, again, depending on personal experience and where you are, on the spectrum, they often resort to a form of communication, which is passive communication. So, in their mind, or, the words that come out are often yes. I can do XYZ. But the body language tells you something different. So if someone is feeling shaky or apprehensive, and you can see that by the way they're fidgeting or something, that in reality means no, I can't do XYZ. But it's very difficult because the person isn't using their words to express that they can't do something. Now, there are many reasons as to why autistic individuals in particular resort to people pleasing, one of which is low self-esteem. So if you don't believe in yourself, if you don't have faith in yourself, then of course you may resort to this type of behavior. And depending on the individual, they could have grown up in an environment where abuse or narcissism, is normalized. So, I mean, technically, in terms of my extended family, I grew up in a somewhat controlling environment. So, if you've listened to my previous episodes regarding my experience with verbal abuse, I've had instances where my dad's family would look at me as a very stupid person. And as a child, I couldn't understand why they didn't really care for me as much. But even then, I could see that I was being treated differently to the rest of my so called cousins. And I guess growing up in that type of environment as well didn't really help because it was one rule for me and another for everyone else. So, in order to be accepted, I had to change everything about myself, from the clothes I wore to the things I would say, just to gain some form of love and acceptance. And now I don't do that because I don't talk to these people. And that is how I choose to deal with things. But for others, it's not so easy to just distance themselves, because when you're in such an environment for years, you begin to assume this is normal when it isn't. And at times, the individual with autism will feel that there's a need to earn affection by doing what others want. So again, it's hard to identify when someone's being narcissistic, abusive, or even manipulative. Now, as mentioned, I have unfortunately had these types of experiences, even with friendships, where I've had to change my personality, which of course I've already mentioned. And in the case of family, I've had to be the one who would put in the effort for everyone else. So if there was a social event with my dad's family, I had to make the effort to turn up. But when it was like my 16th birthday, none of them made the effort for me. So it was like, why am I doing this when no one is doing the same for me? So, of course, this really hurt me in my teens. It kind of did, because it showed that I wasn't even a part of the family, I didn't belong, and it was kind of sad, even as a child as well, knowing that this was how I was being treated. Now, with one particular friendship I experienced going through, which I'm glad I ended all those years ago. So, to be specific, I ended this friendship, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. There was this constant need to be a form of emotional support. And people might think or question how this relates to people pleasing. But in a way, this experience does relate to people pleasing, because I was often the one, again, putting my needs aside for someone else. So I had a friendship for over 10 years with an individual, and I was the one putting all my time in for this person. So, if I was doing an assignment for university, they would call and say they had a problem, and I would put my coursework aside and I guess give this person my full attention. So, in other words, there was this constant need to be like a therapist where I would have to listen and give advice. And sometimes I couldn't give advice all the time because if there was a situation that I've never experienced, I am not going to advise people. And this is because I don't fully understand what is going on in that person's head. And I don't want to say something that comes off disrespectful, nor do I want to give unrealistic advice. Now, if I tried to give this person realistic advice, I was always told I was being negative. And sometimes it was ironic because this person went on about honesty, but I felt like there was no honesty with them. I had to say what they wanted to hear in order to keep the friendship. And I didn't like doing that because, again, I was compromising my values and my needs for somebody else. Now, I have gone into this a little bit in a previous podcast, but I do find that most relationships are very transactional, and people might ask how this relates to people pleasing, but this is quite relatable because in a lot of modern relationships, people pick out targets in a sense, and they want to see how much they can extract out of you. And in turn, you get taken advantage of and discarded when you've outlived your usefulness. And you might not even realize how much time and dedication you're putting into a relationship, especially if the individual is, again, being abusive in some way or manipulative and you don't realize. And it does relate a lot to people pleasing. It really does, because as mentioned, the whole point of people pleasing is putting your needs at the bottom. So you are compromising yourself in order for other people to feel happy, and you are hurting yourself without realizing. So, in order to figure out how to navigate people pleasing, you need to recognize what your needs are and how you implement them. So, practicing and actually saying the word no if you're not ready to take on a favor or a request helps. And by saying no, you are making it clear that you're not going to be walked over like a doormat. Now, when it comes to navigating people pleasing, being assertive is the key. So, being assertive isn't about being aggressive and saying that somebody else's needs are unimportant, unlike your own. It's recognizing that whilst others' needs are important, yours are as well. So, if, for example, you're at work and a colleague needs help with a task and you have your own to deal with, you need to tell them that you are finishing off a task and then you have free time to help that individual. Either that, or if you're both struggling with specific tasks at work, you can find a way to even out the workload. So one person takes on one half of the workload, another person takes on another half, and that way you get the work done quickly but also efficiently. Another thing you need to keep in mind as well is making sure that you don't take on too much. Now, in certain environments like a workplace, it can be easier said than done because managers or colleagues do expect a lot out of you. And it's also the same thing even in education, where your teachers expect you to not only focus in classes, but to do multiple assignments. And sometimes, again, it's very difficult to get everything done because your mind is just focusing on too much. Now, it's not to say multitasking is a bad thing, but sometimes too much of it burns you out. And I've had experiences myself, mainly in my old job, where I've taken on a lot and I've had colleagues ask me for help and I've been too ashamed to admit that I needed help. And I guess it's because I've always wanted to prove that I'm capable of doing so much. And this is a mentality I've had for years, because in school, mostly, people underestimated my intelligence and assumed that I would fail at exams and fail all the way through life. And I've always felt the need to prove 10 times harder than everyone else that I'm just as capable of doing tasks like any neurotypical person. Now, knowing that you are unable to fix everybody else's problems also helps, because let's face it, the world is always going to be unfair, as cliche as it sounds. It really isn't fair. And you are not an octopus. You can't stretch yourself thin in order to accommodate everyone else. And if people don't like that, then it just goes to show those are the types of people that you really don't need in your life. And it is very important to recognize toxic behavior and when people are being very transactional towards you, especially when it comes to family and friends, because anybody who is like that deserves to just be cut off from your life. And I know this kind of advice is a bit harsh, but this is how I feel. And nowadays, if I get the sense that somebody is not being honest and true to me and is just there to extract something out of me, I will cut them off, because I've already got to a point where I've been through so much, especially in terms of toxic behavior. And I don't want to put myself in a position where I'm going back to certain parts of my childhood, for example, where I'm being taken advantage of ever again. So it's always best to recognize the toxic behavior around you. So this is the end of today's episode. And as always, I hope you've enjoyed it. I also thank you all for continuing to support this podcast by listening to my episodes and providing comments and feedback. And of course, as always, comments and feedback are much appreciated, especially as I can provide more quality content. So, the next episode, which will be released on the 8th of December, is about art therapy and how it helps autistic individuals, especially in terms of communication. Now, I am going to be delving a bit into what I've been studying so far in my art therapy course and also some of the research I've done in terms of how it helps people with autism, as I never really realized that art therapy could go that far. So, apart from that, I hope you guys have a great Sunday and enjoy the rest of your weekend and make sure you get plenty of rest. And until the next episode, this is goodbye for now.